see me? Do I need to stand here, Anastasia? Or can I stand? Hi, good evening, everybody, and a warm welcome to this special joint session of the Barbados Genealogy Group and the History Group. We're delighted to have you with us at the Barbados Museum and Historical Society, whether you're here in person or joining us online. Today's talk, Across Centuries and Continents, 3 Generations of Franklin McNicoll Women in Bridgetown, promises to be a fascinating journey through personal and collective history. We're honored to welcome our distinguished presenters, Dr. Pader O. McCurtain and Professor Nigel Leask, and look forward to the insights that they'll be sharing. A little background, the Barbados Genealogy Group, which is led by our librarian, Harriet Pierce, and launched in March 2014, has grown into a vibrant support network for anyone with an interest in tracing family roots, regardless of experience. Similarly, since 2008, the History Group, founded by our current Deputy Director, Kevin Farmer, has provided a platform for exploring and exchanging research related to Barbados. And this collaboration reflects our ongoing commitment to community research and storytelling and how these threads continue to connect us across time and space. Thank you for being here, and I hope that you enjoy today's session. And I would now like to invite Harriet to introduce our speakers.
Thank you, Natalie. Good evening, everyone. It is great to be here. I know many of you have been asking for the genealogy group to have in-person meetings, so I'm very happy to welcome those of you who are here with us, as well as those joining us online. It is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Pader O. Moriarty. Got it? Yes. And for those of you who are Sherlock Holmes fans, you would know Moriarty was his nemesis. And Professor Nigel Leask, who will speak on the topic Across Centuries and Continents, 3 Generations of Franklin McNicoll Women in Bridgetown. Dr. Pader is a senior lecturer in Celtic and Scottish Studies at the University of Edinburgh, and he is an expert on Irish and Scottish Gaelic literature and culture. Professor Nigel Leask is Emeritus Professor of English at the University of Glasgow, and he is an expert on Scottish literature and empire. This evening, our talk will look, as I said, at 3 generations of Barbadian women. When she died on Bay Street, Bridgetown in 1920 at the age of 98, Joanna McNicoll was the last surviving child of Major Dougal McNicoll, a Scottish Gaelic poet and soldier who had been active throughout the West Indies, and Joanna Franklin, a free Afro-Barbadian woman. Today's talk will examine the lives of 3 generations of Barbadian women, starting with Joanna McNicoll, who died in the 20th century, and ending with her maternal grandmother, Anne Rose Franklin, who was most likely born into slavery during the second half of the 18th century. So it promises to be a very interesting talk, and if I should say, it's the precursor to a larger activity next year, which Nigel and Pader will tell you all about. So I want to invite Pader to come to the podium.
Now I think that should be visible to you all. Thanks very much, Harriet, for that really warm Barbadian welcome to both myself and Nigel. We're really grateful to the museum and the history group and the Genealogical Society for the chance to speak to people both here in the museum this evening and to those of you online as well. It's been great to see the museum and to meet staff, staff here, curators, librarians, and everyone. It's been really invigorating in lots of ways. So, born and bred on the island of Lismore, a very small inner Hebridean island. My slide isn't working. There we go, now it is. So born and bred on the island of Lismore and raised in mainland Argyll on the southwest coast of Scotland, the Gaelic poet and writer, prose writer, Dougal MacNicol was born in 1791 and died in 1844. But he was born and died in Scotland, but spent much of his adult life serving as an army officer, British army officer in the Caribbean, based primarily in Barbados, where around the year 1816 he formed what would be a very enduring partnership with Joanna Franklin, a free woman of colour. The project that both myself, I'm based at the University of Edinburgh and Nigel is based at the University of Glasgow. The project that we're working on at the moment is dedicated to producing an edition, normalised text and English translation of MacNicol's writings, his prose travel writings, which cover both Argyll and the Caribbean, and his verse, which was composed again in both Scotland and in the Caribbean. And as Harriet alluded to, this is a sort of a precursor, if you like, tonight of a conference that we hope to host next year in collaboration and partnership with the museum, looking at other instances of Gaelic, Gaelophone, Irish and Scottish Gaelic speakers in the Caribbean and their legacy. So the structure of the talk this evening is that I'm now going to stop, having sort of introduced the project as it were. I'm going to stop. Nigel is going to talk about MacNicol's life and give us a sense of the literature that he produced, and then I'm going to carry on with the rest of the talk and look specifically at this 3 generations of Barbadian women that were involved in Dougal MacNicol's life. So I'll now hand over to Nigel.
Thank you, Pater. And I just endorse Pater's remarks. We've had a fantastic warm welcome here, and it's really, it just feels great. Neither of us been in Barbados before. I only arrived yesterday, or the day before yesterday rather, but it's been a fantastic experience, and we've already managed to find that the archives are open. So that's been a real little, we weren't expecting that. So I'm just going to talk very briefly about say a little bit more about Dougal MacNicol, who's the poet upon whom the project is focused. Before I hand over to Pater, who's going to say more about the MacNicol Franklin women, who are an extraordinary, story in their own right. So I just want to start by saying perhaps a word about what it means to be looking at a Gaelic poet in the Caribbean, in the colonial era, in the era of enslavement. In a sense, one can think about a double exclusion, albeit one without any parity in the scale of exploitation. On the one hand, that of enslaved Africans and freed people of African descent in Britain's oldest and most lucrative sugar colony, and the other of Scottish Gaels, members of a minoritized white culture and language at home, who nevertheless profited from servicing Britain's colonial empire in the Caribbean. And MacNicol here recollects in one of the poems that he composed in Barbados in August 1813, and I won't read it all, Shemi Horstan Asturni, Gol Akachel Mochucha, Skaberach Erson Kunyak Naor. It was misfortune that directed me to leave my country, i.e. Scotland, and not a desire for coin or gold. The nature of this misfortune is unspecified, though it may refer generally to his situation as the fatherless 8th son of an impecunious family. even if he wasn't motivated by cunyac na oer, the desire for gold, McNicoll entered colonial service as human capital in the sense deployed by Andrew McKillop in a recent study underlining the disproportionate Scottish and Irish deployment of human capital through high-risk, high-return forms of migration, which constituted a compensatory tactic designed to counter poverty in the orthodox financial sense. I'm not going to say much about the Gaelic world here, but this was a map of Gaelic-speaking Scotland in Dougal's lifetime. The shaded area is the parts of Scotland where few people would have spoken English. And it's a remarkably misunderstood fact that around about 1800, when the population of Britain and Ireland was about 15 million people, there were probably upwards of 3.25 million people who couldn't speak English, who spoke a Celtic language. They either spoke Welsh or Scottish Gaelic, or the preponderant majority spoke Irish. But many of those people would not have been able to speak English. And that's just not understood. You know, we think of Britain in this period as an island, as a largely Anglophone world, and that's just not the question. So, research on the Gaelic Atlantic in this period has understandably centred on North America, and especially Nova Scotia, where most of the Gaels from Scotland migrated to the northern parts of Canada, to the Canadian Maritimes. But McNicoll's writing reminds us of the significant Gaelic presence in the British West Indies, recently studied by scholars like Sheila Kidd, Michael Morris, and David Alston. Just interesting that Sheila Kidd has looked at the subscribers list for this Gaelic dictionary published in 1828, the Highland Society's Gaelic Dictionary. A staggering 60% of the subscribers were domiciled in Jamaica, which of course of all the Caribbean islands had the densest Scottish population. But it suggests the strength of the Gaelic community in Jamaica, at least, and as we're finding, not nearly as strong here in Barbados, which is known as Little England, but nonetheless, we are finding evidence of a quite a robust Gaelic-speaking community on this island as well. So there's also, for Scottish history, there's a very important and troubling story here about the fact that in the era of emancipation, post-1834, just over 1/3 of the total area of the West Highlands and Islands of Scotland was sold into the hands of people directly or indirectly enriched by slavery. It's a monumental case of money laundering. So these people have achieved, this is dirty money, they've been paid all this money by the UK government at the time of emancipation. So what do? They buy land. They reinvent themselves as Highland lairds. And it's a way of laundering that money. And as McKillop and McKinnon point out, those who secured such wealth from slavery tended in turn to see any land they owned, basically, regardless of geography, in similarly extractive terms, with the emphasis on economies of scale, the benefits of market-driven specialization, be that kelp or tobacco, sugar or sheep, cotton or deer. So despite the huge geographical distances between the Caribbean and the Scottish islands, there are certain affinities at work here. The other thing to say is that there's very little prose writing by Gaelic speakers in this period. In fact, Dougal McNicoll's travel journal, which called it, we found it in the National Library of Scotland in a manuscript, that's what we're editing and translating. It's pretty much unique. There's almost no other, we haven't found any other travel accounts written in Gaelic from the same period. It's known as Dougal McNicoll's Barbados journal as well, because the final section of it deals with his life, his movement and transport to travel to Barbados in 1809, and briefly. So it's a bit frustrating because he doesn't say a great deal. Much of the autoethnography for Gaels in this period survives in song, in Gaelic song, and of course Dougal's main work really are these at least 9 songs, which are really very important, which we're also editing. So, just say that the McNicoll papers in the National Library of Scotland in Edinburgh contain the Gaelic journal and song poems, and they've never been properly transcribed. So our edition will be a milestone, we hope, in that respect. Okay, just a word here about the man himself. We've heard a little bit in introduction from Pater. Dugald was the 12th child and 8th son of the celebrated minister called the Reverend Donald McNichol of Lismore. And these ministers, these Presbyterian ministers, had big families. And this guy, his dad was a very literary guy. He wrote this book called Remarks, a huge attack on Samuel Johnson, Dr. Samuel Johnson, who published, as many people know, a tour of the Highlands and Islands in 1775. And it was bristling with Scotophobic prejudice. So McNichol stood up and fought back. And this book was the most substantial answer from the voice of the Gaels to Dr. Johnson's put-downs. After his father's death, Dugald was raised by his mother, Lilias Campbell, and his uncles in the town of Inverary in Argyll, and at his uncle's farm of Achlian, between Dalmally and Loch Oer. Here you can see a picture of the house today, which we visited just last September. The view, amazing view of Loch Oer from the house. After his father's, in November 1809, he obtained a commission as an ensign in the Royal West India Rangers, in which regiment a more celebrated Highland soldier, David Stewart of Garth, who was later governor of St. Lucia, held the rank of colonel. Despite the military distinction of its colonels and its royal designation, the Rangers, the Royal West India Rangers, was one of the British Army's 3 penal or punishment battalions. Its ranks composed of mainly European deserters or defaulters, described as the most notorious ruffians. In his History of the British Army in the West Indies, Roger Buckley writes that the Rangers were condemned to perpetual service in the West Indies, unlike the other regular regiments, which served only 5 years in the region before being withdrawn to other stations, a fact which contributed to their high death and desertion rates. There's an interesting, with something very fascinating in the archive, we discovered that when we were, we assumed that Dugald had been commissioned into a really high status regiment called the 1st Regiment of Foot, the Royal Scots, because his name appears in the army lists in 1842. You can see I put a cross against it. Sorry, you can't see it very well. But that is a piece of historical fiction, because he wasn't. In fact, he was, when we did further inquiry, we found the papers of the Royal West India Rangers for 1809, and his name appears here, scribbled in pen, his name misspelt and written in pen. It shows that actually he was commissioned into this really toxic regiment. And he later, in 1825, managed to buy a commission in a more respectable in the Royal Scots. He'd come into money and he was able to, it was very expensive to buy an army commission in this period. You had to pay to get a military rank. On the 28th of March, 1810, McNichol sailed from Greenock in the Clyde for Barbados, and he saw service, initially at least garrison duty, in Barbados and other Caribbean islands, and in later decades in Ireland and in Canada as a captain and then a major in the Royal Scots Regiment. The military record reveals he rapidly transferred to the status of an unattached or staff officer, serving in Barbados as aide-de-camp to Major General Fitzroy Maclean from December 1812 to June 1815, when he accompanied Maclean back to Britain, and that he subsequently served as an itinerant Deputy Assistant Quartermaster General, it's quite a mouthful, on the staff of the West Indies from September 1817 to June 1828, when he was stationed in Barbados, Dominica, St. Lucia, Martinique, Antigua, Guadeloupe, St. Kitts, Grenada, Tobago, St. Vincent, Trinidad, and Demerara. So he got to see the Caribbean. Yeah, this was the guy he was ADC to. So Fitzroy Jeffreys Grafton Maclean, who was the governor of St. Thomas and St. John, decorated for his role in capturing Guadeloupe. In 1794, Maclean became proprietor of the slave plantation of Sixman's Estate in Barbados upon marrying the widowed Elizabeth Bishop, née Kidd. And he was paid this enormous sum of money at emancipation, which helped his grandson buy back Jewett Castle in Mull, which became the centre, the seat of the Clan Maclean. That shows that there's this, again, this shows the links between the Highland culture and land ownership and slave capital from enslavement. After the Rangers were disbanded in 1819, as I've said, he remained on the West Indies as staff officer and then transferred to the from the Rangers to the 93rd Regiment and then to the First Royals. And he managed to do that without paying much money. He was then deployed to Trinidad, where he was in 1827, where he spent the 4 succeeding years. He spent most of that time there. His joining the regiment at this point, the Royal Scots, may indicate that he wished to remain a staff officer and to remain in the Caribbean, possibly for familial reasons. That he was often accompanied by his family, and we're going to hear a lot more about Joanna Franklin and his family in a minute, during his itinerant Caribbean service is evidenced by the fact that his youngest son was born in St. Lucia in 1833, and according to his burial record, another son was born in 1823 on sea, perhaps while travelling between Barbados and St. Lucia or another island. As mentioned above, in 1831, both McNichol and his partner, Joanna Franklin, about whom we're going to hear more in a minute, were residing in Trinidad, where they signed the slave register. And the same year, Captain McNichol is briefly mentioned in Captain Alexander's account of Trinidad in a book called Transatlantic Sketches. And Dugald is mentioned as an officer who, quote, for 20 years has enjoyed uninterrupted good health in the West Indies. Dugald was back in Trinidad again in April 1832 to troubleshoot a political protest by the island's planters against the imminent Slavery Emancipation Act. As reported by the Port of Spain Gazette, Captain McNichol of the First Royals arrived here yesterday, sent, we understand, by Governor Farquharson of St. Lucia to ask Sir Lewis Grant, who was the governor of Trinidad, for advice how he is to act under the circumstances. There was nothing really remarkable about McNichol's military career as we've been able to reconstruct it. Rather a glacial progress up the ranks from ensign in 1809 to half-pay major in 1841, when he retired from the army and returned to Inverary a year or so before his death in Glasgow on the 7th of April 1844. He didn't see much action in the Caribbean during the Napoleonic War, and he might have been promoted more quickly if he had. He was in Britain during Buss's rebellion in Barbados at Easter 1816, one of the biggest uprisings of enslaved people in the British colonies in the decades before emancipation, but he makes no mention of it. As an officer in the Royals, he also served in Ireland in 1836, and having transferred from 1st to the 2nd Battalion of the Royals, saw action in repressing the anti-colonial Canadian Fi de Liberté rebellion in 1838. He returned to Scotland in 1841, resigned his army commission in December of that year. Judging from his will, drawn up in Inverary on the 7th of February 1843, he nevertheless managed to accrue a considerable fortune in the West Indies. It's possible that McNichol was unwell at the time he made his will, a little over a year later on the 7th of April 1844, when he died in Glasgow. I'm just going to round off now and hand over to Padder, but just first of all, I just want to show a couple of slides of the material, of the manuscripts that we're engaged with. This is a manuscript, Dugald's handwriting, of 2 of his Gaelic poems, or Oran, and you can see here, Oran Arana Anan Elan Barbados. So he's giving the Gaelic name for the island of Barbados in October 1816. He's got quite a good hand. It's nice if you're editing this material to be able to read it quite clearly. Most of what he says in the poetry about Barbados, frankly, isn't very complimentary. He's very homesick in the early period. He's missing Argyll. I won't read this in Gaelic, but he says, it's time to be coming to the end of my tale. In this island without melody or music. Where was he? Why? There was a lot of music in Barbados. He couldn't hear it. Where I hear no strains except the regimental drum, where I see no one who welcomes my tongue. My strength and spirit have failed me, my courage is lost, my any cheerfulness in my mind is gone. Unfriendly is this land in which I have come, where I see no friend to ask after me. This is just about the time when he meets Joanna, and the story changes a little bit. He gets a little bit less homesick, a little bit less nostalgic. And here's a page of the journal. You can see, again, quite clearly copied out and almost certainly written out in Gaelic, as I said, almost uniquely, but written in Barbados. We need to do some tests on the paper mark just to make sure, to see whether the paper is paper he's brought from Europe or whether it's paper he might have bought here in Bridgetown. He's an amateur artist. There's a couple of little watercolor sketches in his Barbados journal. Of his home country in Argyll. You can see Loch Awe and Kilkern Castle and Ben Cruachan there. Again, a homesick couple of views. On the whole, we think that he's writing in Gaelic in order to read aloud to a group of other Gaelic speakers here in Barbados, because these are not really private. They're produced for performance in a way. So we suggest, because he's in the army as well, that he's rather cut off from society at large. But there is one mention of him being invited to visit Mr. Sober at Ashton Hall Plantation. And he describes how from breakfast to dinner time we'd be riding or playing games at home, eating dried sugarcane around the house until night time, and all night we would dance and sing songs. So he's clearly cheered up a bit. And in fact, the journal is a much more cheerful document than the poems. The poems are very mournful, partly in the generic tradition of Gaelic verse of this period. There's not a great deal of reference to enslavement or race, but there's a slightly unpleasant incident where he describes swimming in the sea. He seems to be garrisoned up near Spikestown, and he goes swimming with another Scottish soldier in the sea, but two boys steal their clothes. And they have to, we saw a black boy running away with our clothing. We went ashore as fast as we could, and I followed him first before Patrick came out of the water. But fortunately for him, I didn't catch him. Just as I was stretching out my arm to catch him by the throat, I trampled a briar, and he got home before I was ready to follow. So the guys clamp fig leaves or whatever on their intimate parts to try to recapture their garments. He goes to Dominica, where he says, I met many Gaels there in Dominica who were all very kind to me. So I think that's where I'll stop and hand over to Pater, who's going to talk about the Bajan women in Dougal's life. Thank you.
Thanks very much. So I'm going to, as I said, I'm going to talk about three Barbadian women that are important in Dougal MacNichol's story, because in doing any research of any type, I suppose you always have unexpected byproducts, but their story was unexpected for us. And when we started to unearth it, it became clear that we wanted it to be more than simply a footnote, that it was something that required more discussion and more thought and more research. So in order to sort of present what is a larger body of evidence and something that's vaguely coherent today, I'm going to talk about the three generations of these women. So first of all, his daughter, Joanna MacNichol, her mother and her aunt, also named Joanna, and Mary Nichols Franklin, and her grandmother, Anne Rose Franklin. So we're starting with Joanna MacNichol, moving on to her mother and her aunt, and then finally we'll talk about her grandmother, Anne Rose. And the reason to start with Joanna MacNichol is we don't actually know a huge amount about her life, but she's of interest, or I find her of interest, in that she's someone who's actually quite surprisingly close to our own time. She only died in 1920, and she died in 1920 at the age of 98 years. So she died a very elderly woman. She was a resident of, this is her burial record. You can see her place of residence or abode is St. James Cottage on Bay Street, so not that far from where we are this evening. And she lists her father's name as Major MacNichol. Major MacNichol doesn't get a first name, but it is Dougal. And her mother as Joanna Franklin. As Nigel mentioned, Joanna was one of Dougal MacNichol's 7 surviving children with his esteemed friend, Joanna Franklin. And I refer to Joanna Franklin as Dougal's esteemed friend because those are the terms in which she's mentioned in Dougal MacNichol's will, which is drawn up in 1843. He refers to her as his esteemed friend, which is a coded way of saying that they were in a relationship that went on for some time, not least because they had 8 children together, 7 of whom survived into adulthood, and 7 of whom are mentioned in McNichol's will, which he draws up in Scotland in 1843, a year ahead of his death in 1844. And the children that are mentioned are Mary Eliza, whose dates you see there, 1817 to 1874. James William Davis Smith, I don't know who he was trying to impress with a big long list of names, but James William Davis Smith McNichol, or Franklin McNichol, was born in 1821. Donald Joseph, 1823 until 1890. Alice, born in 1825. Nichol, Nichol McNichol is a thing. That is a thing. Joanna, who I've just mentioned, who lived up until 1920, and Dougal Charles Farquharson, who lived from 1833 to 1866. Some of these, they were all born in the Caribbean, some of them in Barbados, some of them in St. Lucia, and I think Dougal Charles Farquharson is recorded as being born at sea. So this is our Joanna, and this is where she fits into this scenario. She is one of the beneficiaries then as a child. She's one of the beneficiaries of McNichol's will, along with Joanna Franklin, who is also named as an executrix of the will. So quite unusual that Joanna Franklin will be named as an executrix of the will, but it's quite clear that there was a high degree of mutual trust between Joanna Franklin and Dougal McNichol. All of these names, incidentally, Mary, James, Donald, Alice, Nichol, and Dougal, all of these, with the exception of Joanna, are McNichol family names. They are names that occur in Dougal McNichol's own genealogy. They're the names of his parents or the names of his own siblings. So the only one who's named for her mother is Joanna McNichol. So she's of relevance in that sense as well, that she is named for her mother. And Joanna Franklin, her mother, is, as I say, she's named in the will as executrix. She's someone who's extremely capable, and she's also someone who's extremely interesting. And she has been noted before in Warren Allen's book on historic Bridgetown. He notes her and her sister, Mary Nichols Franklin, and he refers to them in this quotation from that book, where he says, during the later part of the 18th century, the land immediately, he's referring to the land immediately east of St. Michael's Cathedral, at one time called Spring Garden, was owned by James Polgreen, who left it to his wife in his will, which was proved in 1797. But by the early 19th century, it had passed into the ownership of two ladies, Mary and Joanna Franklin, who in 1820 offered it for sale in lots. And you can't quite see the rest of the quote, but this would seem to have marked the beginning of the establishment of Church Village. Warren Allen's evidence for this is taken from the Barbados Mercury. And you can see here the advert from 1816, which ran, where Mary Nichols Franklin and her sister Joanna are selling the land all in one go, or in also willing to sell it in lots, of 83,000 square feet of pretty, what I think would be now, and probably was then, prime real estate in Bridgetown in Barbados. And one thing, just given that we're here in the museum, one thing that I'd like to note is the degree to which this image from the Barbados Mercury is taken from the Digital Library of the Caribbean, which in turn has been digitized from the copies of, I understand, the copies available here belonging to the museum. And it's really a phenomenal resource for anyone interested in Caribbean history or genealogy. It's proved really, it has opened so many doors for us working on this material on another continent. So Mary and Joanna Franklin are in possession of 83,000 square feet right by the cathedral in 1820, and they're offering it for sale in lots. They're still offering it for sale in lots in 1825, or selling bits of it off. This is an extract taken from, many of you will be subscribers to the newsletter of the Barbados Genealogy Group. This is in May 2024. Dr. Patricia Stafford, who's been immensely helpful to us, dug up a deed relating to 1825, when the two sisters they have become indebted to a woman named Mary Richard Clark, and as Pat says, to settle this debt, Mary and Joanna transferred just over £370 for a piece of land just over 11,000 square feet in Polgreens Ground, Bridgetown, again adjacent to St. Michael's Cathedral. So that they're still in possession of, they don't sell it all off in 1820, is the point, I guess. And even as late as 1863, we find a note in the Times of Bridgetown, 1868, I should say. We still have the Franklin McNichol real estate moguls are still in possession of some of this land, where Mary Nichols Franklin, whose proportions are greatly reduced, but I also imagine development has occurred. Mary Nichols Franklin owns 355 square feet. Dougal McNichol owns just over 10,000. This isn't our Dougal, and it's not Dougal's son Dougal. This is in fact a grandson of Dougal McNichol. Owns just over 1,000 square feet, and Joanna Franklin owns 823 square feet. So that the land is owned between the two sisters and a grandson or grandnephew. The land has passed to them, and this sort of transgenerational transfer of wealth is sort of a recurring theme. Another indication of their wealth is their ownership of enslaved people. And we have here an advert, or notice rather, from the Barbadian appearing in 1832, where Mary Nichols Franklin notes that an enslaved person named Suki Craig, late the property of Mrs. Craig, has absconded herself from the subscriber, is the way that it's framed. So this is an indication of their wealth as Joanna and Mary both own enslaved people. In that sense, they are not atypical of the economically prosperous free women of colour that are very much a feature of Bridgetown in this period and have been studied by Jerome Handler in The Unappropriated People, also by Pedro Welch in Slave Society in the City and in other publications. And I'd just also like to say it's such a shame to be here, having used so much of Professor Pedro Welch's work in researching this topic over the last number of years, that he's no longer with us. And also Melanie Newton's study of the children of Africa in the colonies, on her study of free people of colour in Barbados in the age of emancipation. So that this is, if you like, the category to which both Joanna and Mary Nichols Franklin belong, and into which Dougal McNichol has become involved as well. Their mother is a woman named Anne Rose Franklin, and in 1823, Joanna Franklin and Dougal McNichol are in St. Lucia together. And this is another feature of their relationship, is that not only are the children born throughout the Caribbean, but the families sort of move en masse with one another. And in 1823, Dougal is stationed in St. Lucia, and Joanna is with him. And 1823 is one of the years in which the register of enslaved people is required to be filled in Barbados. And gives us another sense of the degree to which these people, Dugald and the Franklin women, are functioning as a family unit, is the fact that the register of enslaved people in Barbados is filled in on behalf of Joanna and Dugald by the other Franklin women. So Mary Nichols Franklin, who's described in terms that make clear that she's of mixed heritage. Mary Nichols Franklin fills in the form on behalf of Dugald McNichol. And Anne Rose Franklin, who's described in terms that make it clear that she is a black woman, not of mixed racial heritage. She fills it in for Joanna Franklin, who is described on those same forms in terms that make clear that she is of mixed heritage. So that there's good reason to believe then that Anne Rose Franklin is the mother of Mary Nichols, who's born in 1793, and Joanna, who's born in 1797. And I can't remember what the rest of the slide was going to say there, so I can't tell you what I was going to say, but it may come to me eventually. So it has come to me. So there's good reason to believe that Anne Rose Franklin is the mother of these two women, and that they may or may not share a father, but they're both born around from the 1790s onwards. Anne Rose is a very interesting person, a very interesting woman. She's described as a free woman in the Barbados Mercury as early as 1807, when she's convicted of assault and fined £10 and bound in the penalty of £50. Now, that's interesting in lots of ways. It's interesting because as a free black woman, she wouldn't have had recourse to the courts. But it's also interesting that she had £10. She could be fined £10. She was. It's an indication that she was a woman of some financial means. And as Hilary Beckles has said, the majority of free blacks in the 1820s in Barbados were manumitted persons who had been born into enslavement, even as late as the 1820s. So that it's quite clear that Anne Rose had more than likely been born into slavery, and so it's a possibility that that Anne Rose and her daughters were manumitted together. But of course, it's very difficult to prove that because of the lack of records documenting that. So Anne Rose, just like her daughters, was also a woman of some wealth. And just two indications of wealth or property, taken again from the newspapers. In 1811, an advert for an enslaved house servant, a good house servant and butler who can attend on a horse and chaise. And in 1816, she also lists for sale house and land. So to be sold 2 houses and land leading from Reed Street to Mason Hall Street. One a stone wall and the other a boarded and shingled house, the latter not quite finished, standing on a plot of ground containing 2,291 square feet. This is no longer a street. It's all entirely built up, but it's in quite a central location in Bridgetown. So these are two from 1807. We have this indication that she's a freed woman. By 1811, we have this indication, and even at 1807, that she has some wealth behind her or some property. We get this throughout the 1810s. There are other indications of this wealth or of this property. In 1812, In another notice in the newspaper, she's described as Anne Rose, a free black woman who now occupies the house of Nancy Clark, deceased. So this is 1812. And throughout 1815 throughout 1815, 1816 and 1817, Anne Rose Franklin is described as occupying a large and commodious hotel, part of the estate of the late Anne Clark. And these adverts, these notices I should say, from 1815 to 1817, they relate to the executors, they're issued by the executors of Anne or Nancy Clark's, Nancy Clark of the hotel, where Anne Rose is presented as a tenant, in other words, running the hotel. Now this contradicts the claim that has been made, not a claim, but the supposition that has been made by Jerome Handler, for instance, that Nancy Clark's hotel, a very famous hotel, ceased operation in 1812 when it may have been destroyed by fire. It clearly carried on in operation and was operated by Anne Rose Franklin throughout this period. But we do get the indication that the executors of Nancy Clark's will would prefer that it maybe weren't tenanted by Anne Rose Franklin. And there's another reason to say that. Can I read what it says? So yeah, of course. So the subscribers offer for sale the following property belonging to the estate of Anne Clark, deceased, agreeably with her last will and testament. A large and commodious hotel in which she formerly resided, at present tenanted by Anne Rose Franklin, and commands a full view of Carlisle Bay. A small house adjoining, very convenient for a small family, tenanted by Nancy Barnes. A house in the same range, tenanted by Rosetta Maycock. And also a spot of land facing Madeira Street and the pier head, containing just over 6,000 square feet of land, well situated for a lumber yard. The title indisputable, which is always a bit of a red flag. It's always a case of the lady doth protest too much. The title, I think, may have been disputable. Of course, Anne Rose Clark, not Anne Rose Clark, Anne Clark, better known as Nancy Clark, famous well known as a free woman of colour and the one-time proprietor of the Royal Naval Hotel on Canary Street. And Clark herself had inherited the hotel in 1791 from the more famous and better known Rachel Pringle Polgreen, a potential portrait of whom we saw earlier today in one of the galleries. So that we have, I've already talked about 3 generations of family. We could maybe talk about 3 generations of Afro-Barbadian businesswomen working in Bridgetown as well, stretching from Rachel Pringle Polgreen through to Nancy Clark, and on, it would seem, to Anne Rose Franklin, although much less is known about Anne Rose Franklin than either of the other two. Because there the trail does run sort of cold. Anne Rose Franklin, I haven't been able to, I'm sure there may be, but I haven't been able to find any references to her after this, after the period of enslavement. She's not, both her daughters and Dougal McNichol do, but Anne Rose doesn't. But we know that she was alive and reasonably well, because Anne Rose Franklin of Prince William Henry Street in Bridgetown in the parish of St. Michael died at a very old age in the spring of 1860. And if this is the same woman, then Anne Rose Franklin was born around the year 1766, because this Anne Rose Franklin was 94 years of age when she died. And there is, if you like, a pattern there, which I think makes it fairly clear that this is the same Anne Rose Franklin. And that is the fact that we have 3 successive, long-lived generations of Bajan, Afro-Barbadian women in Bridgetown that we've tracked through Joanna McNichol, who died in 1920, aged 98. Joanna Franklin, who died in 1884, aged 87. Mary Nichols Franklin, who died in 1890, aged 97. And Anne Rose Franklin, who died in 1860, aged 94. And there's also this transgenerational, a pattern that seems to emerge is this transgenerational transmission of wealth. Part of the reason that the track, if you like, for Anne Rose Franklin goes cold is because it seems that she had already transferred most of her assets to her daughters by the end of the 1810s, by the start of the 1820s. Mary Nichols, we don't have a will for Joanna Franklin, so we haven't found a will for Joanna Franklin is a better way of putting it. But I suspect that her assets were also given on to her children before she died. Mary Nichols Franklin died unmarried and without children in 1890, say at the age of 97. Myself and Nigel got to see her will yesterday. It was the first document that we went for, that we looked for, and Mary Nichols Franklin left everything that she had to Joanna McNichol, to her niece. So there's a pattern there. There's a pattern there as well. Just to finish on one final point with a view towards the conference that we mentioned at the outset, a conference that would look at the interaction of Irish and Scottish Gaelic speaking Gaels in the Caribbean, their legacy, their family. We'd say that this presentation on these three generations is a byproduct of research on a 19th century Gaelic poet, but that 19th century Gaelic poet is part of a longer tradition of Gaelic engagement and presence in the Caribbean that stretches way back to the middle of the 17th century. And to just illustrate that, I've used here a page written in Gaelic, in the Gaelic typeface, which has gone out of fashion in Scotland by the middle of the 17th century, but remains in Ireland until the middle of the 20th century. It's a catechism printed by Irish Franciscans who are in exile in the Spanish Netherlands. And this catechism is part of the Counter-Reformation. This is essentially an Irish or Gaelic nationalist piece of propaganda. Religious and nationalist propaganda merged together. And in the preface to this catechism, the Irish Franciscans in Louvain, in the Spanish Netherlands, say that they're producing the catechism for three types of people, for three categories. First of all, they say they're producing them for the Irish, the Gaels in Ireland. Second, the Gaels of Scotland. And then also the third category is those Gaels off the coast of, those Gaels who are resident off the coast of America. And it is the first Gaelic language reference to Irish or Gaelophone presence in the Caribbean. So that McNichol's Gaelic production stretches over this much broader and much longer period of engagement. And we'll leave it there because we're out of time. Thank you.
You said something interesting, that when Dougal and his wife arrived in Trinidad, they had to sign the slave register. Could you elaborate on that a bit? And the other question is, how did these women become free women of color? What happened? Who bought their right? Who bought their freedom?
Well, that's, I mean, the slave register of Trinidad is just evidence that they're residing at the point they're stable, that Dougal has been transferred to Trinidad for, we think, 4 or 5 years, and Joanna's with him. And
Because she was a woman of color, he didn't sign the slave register?
she owned enslaved people herself.
Yeah.
She owned more enslaved people than Dougal did, in fact. And that's clear, isn't it, from the register, the 1823 register. I can't remember the number exactly, but
I can't remember.
no, sure. And sorry, in the second question.
How did they become free women of color?
Yes, well, that's the big question.
Somebody had to walk.
Yeah, I mean, the elephant in the room here, which we haven't, sorry, would be no, because the money was there before she met Dougal. The elephant in the room is, which we haven't really said much about here, is the name Franklin, and the possibility, and this is something Pat has suggested as well in her. I mean, Ernest Wiltshire doesn't really buy this, but it's quite possible that that Joanna Franklin's father was Joseph Bailey Franklin from St. Philip, the father of Washington Pitt Franklin, the
Too bad he wasn't here in 1816.
exactly the instigator of Buss's rebellion, who was executed by the British. But we know that Washington Franklin's mother was called Leah. She was an enslaved woman called Leah, whereas it looks like Johanna's. We know that Johanna's mother was Anne Rose.
Yeah.
But it's quite possible that Anne Rose. We haven't got evidence, but Anne Rose might have been manumitted by Joseph Bailey Franklin, and he was obviously a wealthy man. It's possible that the money that comes into her side of the family somehow came from that source, but we can't substantiate that. So we're being a bit cautious. Not yet, but we've asked to see. We've ordered Joseph Bailey Franklin's will from the archive, and it's not clear whether it's there. But Timothy's busy looking for it today, and we're going up tomorrow morning to find out. And our fingers are firmly crossed that we'll find it, because if we find that, it could be very interesting. But it might not be there. So, yeah.
Just to add one more thing to that, in terms of the enslaved people owned by this family nexus. I mentioned that the Franklin women are a sort of a byproduct that we wanted to elevate beyond the status of a footnote. I meant to say in that presentation, didn't occur to me in the second, because we were so focused on them, is that also we've obviously been collecting information on the enslaved people that were owned by the Franklin women and by Dougal themselves, because we would also like to elevate their position to beyond a footnote, because they are documentable, and their trajectories are also documentable, and we want to document them as part of this project. It's an important. We think it's an important thing to do.
We know where they traveled, etc.
Oh yes. Oh yes. Sorry. Yeah. Oh yes.
We're out of the frame.
Oh right.
Good evening. I was very familiar with this Franklin information. And one of the things that startled me, and I'm wondering if it startled you, is that January 1817 advertisement with regards to the property, the estate of Anne Clark. It's noticeable that none of the women are described as free mulattoes, which would be normal in 1817, or free Negroes or free blacks, which would be extremely unusual for the year 1817 for Ironmonger and Spencer, representing the will of Anne Clark, not to have indicated there were free mulattoes. As a researcher, I found that very startling, and it threw me into examining whether white women with those names existed. And I'd just like to share with you that that's a very important avenue when examining that January 1817 advertisement. I think for far too long, the emphasis has been that all of these women may have been free women of color. Some of these women that owned hotels appear to have been white in the society. And I think that is very, very important because it would speak into the abuse of young women in hotels by white women in the society. So I'm sharing that aspect with you because it's something that I looked into and you might want to look into. And also, I am aware then that there is a huge question mark with regards to Anne Rose Franklin being the mother of Joanna. Having said that, I'd like to share that for sure. It would appear that there was a white Anne Rose Franklin who existed because she baptized an infant slave called George Andrew on the 19th of July, 1817. Again, it would be unusual for that baptism record not to say that she was a free mulatto, a free Negro, or a free black, which means that there could have been a white Anne Rose Franklin as well. These things have a lot of implications for this type of research, and I pondered throughout the day today whether I should share this or not. But seeing how open you are with your information, I decided I would share that because very often some of these white women did have enslaved women or other women in the society. You copied their names. Women, free women of color had their names. Or the white woman's father or brother or uncle had a child with a woman of color and named the child after his sister, his mother, his aunt.
Yeah.
And all of those things have implications for this type of research. I pay a lot of attention to this because I'm the 5th down from Amaryllis direct. I'm 5th down from Amaryllis,
Okay.
who is also a very renowned woman of color in the society in 1800s. So I've paid a lot of attention to this. And examining her life took me into the life of other women. So I just wanted to share that with you because interestingly enough, on the 19th of July, 1817, when George Andrew, an infant slave of Anne Rose Franklin, it doesn't say free mulatto or free Negro. Below that is also Mary Elizabeth, daughter of Joanna Franklin, a free mulatto. So one woman, and this is on the same page,
Yeah.
one after the other. One woman is not given the normal social classification if she's a non-white, but the one below her is, as a free mulatto. It led me to think that Anne Rose Franklin might be a white person originating in St. Philip who actually had a child with a non-white person, which is another angle.
Yeah, yeah.
And
Thank
she would have been ostracized in the society as a white woman having a child for a non-white. This is the first Joanna, then who has the next Joanna, who's with McNichol.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay? So if Anne Rose Franklin is a white woman who had a child with a non-white, whether he was, as fair as me or he was this gentleman's complexion or whatever, her child would be a free mulatto and so forth. So all of these are interesting things, and I decided that I would share. I debated, but I decided I would share. It's controversial.
No, I'm very grateful
It's
that you.
controversial, but it's very important because I think that white women's role in hotel operation is often overlooked.
No.
And it needs to be brought to the forefront. And we, I can say, and I know I'm directly down from Amaryllis, but I'm not sure how many other people in the society would say that. Amaryllis, as far as I know, they run a hotel, but she had a relationship with a white man and produced certain children who then benefited from that fact. So
No.
I'm just sharing that with
No,
you.
thank you. We're
You're
really,
welcome.
really very grateful, actually. Thank you for sharing that, because another rabbit hole to go down, I'm afraid. Yeah. No, I think that's very useful, and I think that's a very good point, and I'm very, very glad and grateful that you made it. I'll have to go back to um, to some of those records and think about them again.
Yeah, because you would have heard from Papa and whoever that Franklin name, Lyn is St. Philip rooted.
Mhm.
And there was a recent lecture here by Seth Hamill with regards to the Barbados-New York connection, the East Coast, the development of the East Coast of the United States by enslavers
Mm.
and plantation owners in Barbados. And he also, you can pull that up on YouTube, it was right here. He also speaks about the Franklin.
Mhm.
So they were the ones that went on into the United States and they would own the entire what we would call precincts today. And the ones that stayed here in
Yeah.
St. Philip. And non-white children were born by either abusive or mutual agreement with women of color.
Yeah, no, I think thanks very much. I'm very grateful. I'm very, very grateful that you did raise it, because I think it is something worth going back to and just checking. I mean, yeah, I absolutely take your point. There is in some of the newspapers, there is also a sort of a power dynamic involved as well, involving wealthy and propertied free women of colour. Of course, Nancy Clark is also the proprietor of the hotel, is also a free woman of colour, but the executors of her will don't describe her as such. Probably because they're in the position where they are working, they're her clients, I guess.
Yeah, the thing is too that I think some of these women who have FM,
Yeah.
they are so they what we the term that we use nowadays, that they're so white that they pass into white society. And I think David Alston makes a mention of that in his book, which you mentioned before,
Yes.
Slaves and Highlanders, which I would recommend everybody in this room to read. I had to refer to mine up to yesterday based on what I'm doing. But that book deals with that scenario where some of these a lot of these children from this type of relationships, I call them, they're watered down 3 or 4 generations. So by the 1800s, they are as white as, and sometimes whiter than some of the people who come from Wales and Scotland, who are more ruddy skinned. And reference is made to some of these free women of color looking like white women, so they pass off as white women, or they become acceptable as white women. That's another very strong point, and I think this might come out in this advertisement, where these people now are so white that the white community is presenting them in this advertisement as white. You begin to see it in 1834, when even if they're described on the registers as FM or FN, at 1834, on that 1834 register, I have some people who are connected into my line who slip right into the white society. And then they become public servants and so on. And that told me that they were very, very fair. They could pass for white person.
I was just going to mention, to support what you're saying, is that Ernest Wiltshire found some evidence that he tracked two of Dugald and Joanna's grandchildren who emigrated to the United States in about 1903, 1904, and he actually had the US immigration documents in which they're both described as white.
That has such a big social dynamic, because it plays right into 2025.
Yeah.
Because I do a lot of this research too, from a historical and a genealogy perspective. I had, and some of their names work into these women of the 1800s and 1700s who ran the tux. I had a group of ladies here from England who were put on to me, and if I looked at them, you're seeing a white person.
Okay, good evening. I really enjoyed your presentation, and one of the things that came out, I'm currently doing some research that involves trade,
Trade.
and the city Greenock came up, so I was instantly, it piqued my interest, and you mentioned the connection between the enslavers, the Scottish enslavers, and Barbados. And I remember in the research, they spoke about the merchants of Greenock petitioning to be involved in trade, the whole trading arrangement between Barbados and Britain. So that, that part of it, instantly came to my memory, and it also highlights there's growing research on it now, the role of the Scottish persons, merchants, and planters in the Atlantic trading system. One of the things that I found out, and there are many ads in the newspapers, as you mentioned, with traders in Barbados, merchants in Barbados trading directly with Greenock. And rum was an essential part of that arrangement. Rum moving from Barbados to Greenock and being a part of the Atlantic trade system. So that part came out to me. And obviously the genealogical aspect of it, which I'm also, I do some genealogy research, so.
We always think of Scotland's national drink as being whiskey,
Exactly.
but when I was searching for a book on our national poet, Robert Burns, I discovered that Robert Burns' drink of choice was rum punch.
Exactly. So yes, that part of it, piqued my interest, so I just thought I would mention it. Generally, I enjoyed your presentation.
Thank you very much.
Very good.
Thank you.
You mentioned the people who actually made their money from the money they got from the selling sorry, what's the word? Compensation, yes, the compensation. They were the same people, were they, who then went and cleared out all the hills of Scotland and put sheep there and got rid of all the people. Yeah.
What we call the Highland clearances.
Right, thank you.
The Highland clearances, which really are getting going in the same period, and see a huge. The reason the Highlands of Scotland are described as the last wilderness in Europe is because they were turned into wilderness by capitalist farmers and landowners who evicted all the peasant class, the small tenants, forced them to emigrate. Most of them emigrated to Canada, where they occupied ancestral lands of indigenous people in Canada. So there was a terrible, a sad downward spiral. But that's why the Highlands is still so empty, because it was cleared of its population by these same people, many of whom had been involved in enslavement and received huge sums of money in the emancipation payouts in the 1830s.
So we have a great deal more research to come out, and I'm happy that, yes, what you started had led to this, because many of us here in the Caribbean and in Barbados don't seem to understand the importance of these connections. Yeah. And they think that sometimes historians pull these things out of a hat somewhere and not from some research like this. Yeah, so it is important that you continue this research and we get more of us involved in it. Yeah. To share these deep connections, not only with the social impact that happened in a place like Barbados, but what happened in the Scottish Highlands and what happened to Scottish people.
Yeah, we don't want to get into a scale of a competition for victimization or whatever.
No,
but clearly, whatever happened to the Gaels, they were not enslaved.
Exactly.
And that's true also of the indentured labourers who were sent here in the 1700s,
exactly.
1600s rather. But,
I just reviewed a book from, I don't remember his name, from a gentleman in Britain who spoke about that also. Right. And so it is important that we all understand the social impact of these things, not only from the point of view of the family, but
thank you so much
it's
for
important research.
That means a lot. Thank you.
would also just make one point that actually you're absolutely correct, although this is also the case for Gaelic-speaking Scotland and the Caribbean, that when one does read the work of historians, you do sometimes wonder to think that they're sometimes pulling things out of a hat, but it's mostly due to a lack of engagement with actual archives and with actual material and other ideological prejudices that they may bring with them. So thanks very much for.
I just want to clarify that. The public may think.
Yes,
The public may think that historians, like myself, because I'm one, may
Yeah.
think that historians pull these
Yes.
things out of a hat.
Yeah,
But some research, like
Yeah.
what you are doing, is how we can make some analysis.
yeah.
And sometimes the public doesn't think that we do this. So I'm
Yeah.
happy to see something like this, that
Thank
you can
you.
show that it's just not about literature,
Mm,
but, and again, someone, a researcher I met today from Brazil,
mm.
is again showing how these things, impact these societies.
Yeah.
So
Thank
I see where you started, but you see where it's going.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, but it's all
Thank
about
you.
connection, isn't it? It's about
Exactly.
connection.
And we are not out there just doing things willy-nilly. Thank you.
Sorry. I'm a non-historian, but I'm just very interested. My questions are kind of tangential. Is there any information on why the esteemed friend did not accompany him back home?
That's a very good question. That's a very good question. So, and we sort of
Or the children, or any of the
yeah,
children?
that skimmed over that in one sense. McNichol remains in the army until shortly before he dies. He is transferred directly from the Caribbean to another colonial space, to Ireland, and subsequently to Canada, so that in that first instance there isn't, and of course he's unmarried. They're not, because they're not married. I think that might mean that there isn't the same. He doesn't have the same privileges in terms of a domestic relationship. But I think that is probably the reason that she doesn't accompany him, because he's going on not quite on campaign in Ireland, but he is on campaign in Canada. He's part of the war machine, and so so that's.
There's a possibility that she's with him in Edinburgh when he signs the census in 1841, but there's no evidence, is there? I mean,
No, well, she's not recorded in it.
she's not recorded, so she probably isn't there.
She probably
And
isn't.
he seems to have been suffering from very poor health, which is why he comes back. He probably comes back to try to repair his health, but it doesn't work, and he dies the following year, and probably never sees Joanne again, as far as we know. And his sorry, yeah.
One of the things I would mention here is there are certain things acceptable within the Caribbean region. How he will move about with his brown skin girlfriend or his very good friend or whatever it was called. But when you move now to a different setting, Canada, that or to take her back to Europe with him. There's a difference. It doesn't work.
It doesn't
Because
work.
what is there are certain things that you would know are acceptable in the Caribbean region, even at that time.
Yeah. Just, you're absolutely right. But another point to be made, I suppose, would be that actually that what is to go back to the original question. One of the things that you're right in terms of the unacceptability, but that unacceptability does not always translate to unacceptability for children, and it's in the case of Dougal McNichol, it is of note, I suppose, that none of the children go back to Scotland. But the cases where children often do go back to Scotland are where there is money in Scotland to go back to. And in this familial, in this domestic situation, actually, the economic centre of gravity is here. And she is the economic centre of gravity rather than him.
But actually, one of his children does go back to Scotland.
Later life, yeah.
Later life. Which, do you remember which one? What's her name? And it's interesting. She marries the daughter of another Scottish military called Bone, Dr. Bone, who's a military surgeon in Bridgetown, and who's also had a long relationship with a free woman of colour. And he marries, so Dougal and Joanna's daughter marries the son of who's called Bone, and they retire to Ayr in Scotland. So one of them does go back, and they actually get married, you know. So, but that's a bit later in the 1860s or 1870s, if I remember. Yeah. So.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask, you said that Dougal MacNicol had these 9 songs, and I'm just curious what the lyrics were like, what he was singing about.
Yeah, that's a very good question. So it varies. I definitely don't want to sing, and I don't want to sort of play down his creative impulses. Most of the songs are fairly typical of the genre of Scottish Gaelic exile poetry of the period. So that I'd stress that the verse that Nigel referenced on the slide earlier, where he described that he said that he was in an island without music, without where all he hears is the beat of the military drum, and there's no welcome afforded to him. If you're unfamiliar with Gaelic emigrant poetry, you could take that as a slight against Barbados. Whereas, in fact, if you're more familiar with Gaelic poetry, it's a case of it's not you, it's me.
It's just like the blues.
They were all similar to that.
Yeah, it's the most of them. There are one or two that sort of are more exceptional. There's one poem that myself and Nigel have written about, which is composed in St. Lucia, in Pigeon Island, Fort Rodney in St. Lucia, where he is looking out over to Martinique, and he imagines himself as he was at home. He had been home briefly in Argyll as aide-de-camp to General Fitzroy MacLean the year before, and he places himself, stating that he's looking out towards Martinique, he places himself at a similar vantage point at home, and he's looking out over, in this case, the town of Inverary, and he's lamenting the economic decline of Inverary, and basically the collapse of a traditional form of Gaelic society, blighted by misrule. Now, it's interesting that he's taking that sort of perspective on Inverary while in the Caribbean. Another reading of that might be to say that he's also, might be overextending here, but that we could also maybe read a critique of the governance of the Caribbean into that as well is a possibility. But that would require more thought.
There's certainly there's nothing positive about the British Empire. There's no sense of it being a providential enterprise. If you look at a lot of Anglophone poetry written in this period, which I have done, you'll find often rationale, a sort of ideological underpinning of the colonial project, the civilizing mission, all that kind of thing, very often in providentialist, theological terms. And Dougal was the son of a minister, so you might have expected that to be present, but there's nothing of that at all. There's no ever any ideological defense, explicit defense of the British colonial project, which is interesting. But, as far as we know, that he stops writing in Gaelic about 1816. We haven't found anything written after that. We're hoping we might find something, but it's possible he just stopped writing in Gaelic in 1816, which weirdly coincides with the conception of his first child with Joanna Franklin. We can't say there's any connection, but it could be that he suddenly kind of got roots, he's sort of settled here, and he stopped feeling nostalgic and homesick. But we can't. Yeah.
how Europeans saw Afro-Caribbean type rhythms at that period. And there's some literature on that also.
And Padder mentioned the regimental drum, but in Gaelic
Right.
it actually is the, was it Cian? He talks about the big drum. So it's possible he's talking about African drumming, but we can't prove
and
that.
there wasn't much appreciation from Europeans for that
No.
type of
No,
music
no,
at
no.
that period.
No, absolutely. No. That changed a lot later, but
But it's difficult.
yeah.
Do we have any questions from our online audience? No. Any more questions from the floor?
Was there any trace of the children after? I'm just curious about people who lived to 97 and 98 and 17 and 18 something. You know, did that trend continue?
No, I mean,
Yeah, no, I don't know. We do have records of some of the children, of the sort of the grandchildren. We're really kind of still in a process of trying to put those together. The ones that we do have, the records that we do have, are primarily from those that emigrated to the US, and I don't know that sort of remarkable longevity is replicated. But I don't think we don't have the records to confirm that either. Of course, you then get into the much of the US evidence is census based, and of course because of the time lapse in terms of censuses, the next generation or two generations make it much harder to track for, personal data reasons, I guess.
but I think Pat, you were saying that there's not much trace of McNichol as a common surname in modern Barbados. No. Not in the phone book. Not in the phone book.
One of the slides you shared showed how they introduced nickels.
Yeah.
And I think that is very important because at some point they probably could have been more in the Nichols name as Nichols becoming CHOLLS.
Yeah.
You never know, but I do know someone called Nicole from the same end without the mark, Jamaican born, a white Jamaican going back, and her thing is Nicole, and I believe she was Mac Nicole, but she's a Jamaican scenario.
Yeah.
But I didn't say it with anything, but your presentation is fantastic because it really also speaks into the Gaelic, the festival. There's a festival here.
The Celtic.
Yeah, some
Yeah, yeah,
festival.
yeah.
And I always think to myself that so many Barbadians think of people with Scottish roots only trying to link it back to the period of the 1600s when the majority of people who carry I've been trying to say to people that the majority of people who are seeing DNA flowing into Scotland, it's likely from army men
Yeah.
and not from anybody who came here indentured. And the same applies for those people who claim that their ancestors are Irish indentured. It's likely out of the military. They're in the society today, but the reason that they carry the Scottish and the Irish bloodline is likely out of the military, like this gentleman here, Nicole. He's one of the people who built that type of situation.
Certainly the volume.
Important, yes, your research is very important.
Yes, it sounds like we have a lot to discuss over drinks. But before we do that, please join me in giving Connor and Nigel another round of applause for their brief thank yous. Thank you, of course, to Harriet for all her coordination and organization with the genealogy group, to Anastasia for coordinating all the communications and the tech and the live streaming, and our museum colleagues who kindly did the setup for us, both inside and the refreshments. And we'd also like to share that the next time we'll be hosting a joint genealogy and history group will be July 17th, where we'll be joined by Dr. Luke Delmas, who will present glimpses of the goldsmith trade in Barbados during the long 18th century. So thank you all again for your time tonight, and I look forward to sharing some more over drinks.
Thanks a lot.